What up, everybody? Welcome to another episode of Ask Paul. My name is Paul Abernathy, your host for this podcast, and appreciate you taking the time out of your day to join me on the podcast. Hopefully, you're listening on one of your favorite platforms because we are streaming everywhere: Spreaker, Spotify, iHeartRadio, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, many different ways to listen, but there is another way you can listen. You can go to the new Electrician Live broadcast network over on electricianlive.com. That's electricianlive.com. And there you're going to see multiple channels. You're going to see the Electrified channel. You're going to see the Ask Paul channel. You're going to see the Master the NEC channel. And you're also going to see other providers and other shows coming up in the future that are going to be available from the Electrician Live broadcast network. So hopefully you will check it out and bookmark it, because we'll have a lot of shows. You can watch our Electrify, which is kind of the Joe Rogan-esque type of thing, where you can watch the video and listen to the podcast, or you can watch either or whatever you want. And of course, you can get access to listen to all of your favorite Ask Paul episodes right there. But look, if you want to submit a question, or you want one of your questions to be featured on an upcoming episode of Ask Paul, then all you got to do is go to paulabernathy.com. That is paulabernathy.com. And you can go there and submit your question directly to me, and I will get your question and I will answer it either in an email or in an upcoming podcast episode if you are selected. If we think that other people can really learn from your question, then we will do it. Now, if I answer your question and it doesn't answer your question, and maybe it's based on the limited information you provided, remember, you can always do a follow-up. All you've got to do is go back to the website, paulabernathy.com, put your name in there, say that this is a follow-up to an original question, and clarify, and it will be amended to a future episode. So there's many ways that you can participate in it. Again, I don't know it all, and I do my best to try to educate the best I can. And I like to learn something every day. And I learn something from many other educators. I have my mentors in the industry as well as I try to mentor others. Again, we're all at different learning levels. We don't know it all, but we just love the information and we love this trade. So that's what makes it a beautiful thing. Also, I'll remind you that all of these shows are sponsored by Electrical Code Academy Incorporated, a Texas-based corporation. And if you want to get some swag, some neat clothing, hats, embroidered hats and shirts, and that say things like Electrify, Electrician Only, or Master Electrician, or whatever you want to show your pride, go on over to electricianpride.com. That's electricianpride, Pride.com. Show your love. We have a lot of neat things over there, Bluetooth radios, and just a bunch of stuff over there. So check that out. Again, we appreciate everybody that helps support our shows. Again, we appreciate it. And remember, you can listen to us everywhere. All right. So on today's episode, we have one, and I'm going to do my best to try to explain this because it obviously would be easier to explain this with images. But I will do my best to try to do this, and that's why I love doing podcasts. Now, I love videos, but I love podcasts, one, because it forces me to try to explain it and develop a mental picture, kind of give you a mental picture so that you can kind of put yourself into it verbally. And then as you're listening, it just kind of morphs into your mind what I'm trying to describe. At least that's my effort. That's why I'm redundant. That's why I say things over and over again, because I'm trying to paint that picture. So we have a submittal today, and we're going to do our best to try to explain this one. It says, Article 230, Part 4, Electrical Service Entrance Conductors. And he goes, in Article 230.40, or Section 40 of Article 230, it says, number of service entrance conductor sets. If possible, do you mind going over exception 1 through 5? Just a good explanation, please. So he wants it to be very basic. We'll try to keep it as basic as we can. He says, P.S. I think you're the greatest teacher alive. Keep blessing us with your knowledge. Trust me, we're listening. I appreciate that. I'm certainly not the best teacher or the greatest teacher alive. There are way better educators than me and way more knowledgeable people than me. But I do my best at the content that I try to deliver. So again, I totally appreciate you. And thank you for listening. And thank you for being a fan of the shows. I do appreciate it. Okay, so let's do our best here. So a couple of the givens that we're all probably very familiar with. The given is that in 230.2, the number of actual services that I can bring to a building, and that is 1. Now, with that said, there are other allowances to have more than one service to a building. Now, let's keep it simple first. What's a service to a building? Well, let's say I come from a transformer. I have a service drop that comes down. It goes to the side of your dwelling. It goes to a weatherhead. That's the point of attachment. It changes over. Now, those are service entrance conductors. In this case, they're coming down and they're going into the meter. And then probably with the 2020 code, it's also going to hit an exterior emergency disconnect in 230.85. And then it's going to go into your panel. Okay. So those are service entrance conductors. Now, the service drop, for example, is from the pole to the point of attachment. Or a service lateral would be from a transformer. Maybe it's on a pole, goes down and then underground and up to your meter. So that's a service lateral. Those aren't necessarily service entrance conductors. So what we're going to focus is the service entrance conductor aspect of what we're talking about in 230.40 and the subsequent exceptions to this. But I do want you to realize that you could have more than one service to a building if you meet the criteria under 230.2A, B, C, or even D. And so you could meet those criteria and have more than one service to a building. Okay? All right. So just kind of setting the tone there of what we're talking about. All right. So getting to the question that was asked, let's read 230.40. Again, this is under part 4 of Article 230. And it's dealing with service entrance conductors. So it's important for us to identify that up front, what those are. The service entrance conductors. And I guess we could do that even a little further. Let's go on and go to Article 100 and see if there's any definitions that we can read that might give us. Okay, so there are some definitions. And remember what we're talking about, service entrance conductor. So we have what's called service entrance conductors overhead system, and we have service entrance conductors underground system. So this just differentiates which way these come from. Like if it's coming from a service drop to the point of attachment, then those conductors coming down, those would be overhead system type of service entrance conductors, right? And then if it's coming from a service lateral, then it comes in and it comes into the meter, and then going from the meter to the emergency disconnect outside, let's say, and then into the panel. Or I guess you could have a panel outside that also serves as emergency disconnect as well as a service disconnect. Anyway, those conductors would be service entrance conductors from an underground system. Okay. All right. So we do have other definitions called service conductors overhead. Okay. Those aren't service drops. Those would be service conductors that are going overhead. Let's say from where the utility left off and it's still got to go from a pole to get to your house. They would fall under the code, whereas service drops would not. These would be service conductors overhead. But once they connected to the point of attachment to the structure, as they go down, then those would be service entrance conductors overhead system. Okay, just kind of giving you an idea. Now let's read what a service entrance conductors overhead system. What's the definition of that? It says the service conductors between the terminals of the service equipment and the point, usually outside the building, clear of the building wall, were joined by tap or splice to the service drop or overhead service conductors. Okay, so what we're talking about is, let's say it's just a transformer. It drops down to the point of attachment on the side of the building, right? And so the conductors that are going from the service equipment through the wall, through the meter, all the way up to the point of connection to the service lateral, for the point of attachment to the service drop or overhead service conductors in a situation where the drop was on a property where, let's say, the utility stopped at a pole and then the electrician has to pick it up from the pole to the house. Those are not service drops because they stopped at the pole. Let's say if your property was really big and you lived a mile in, the utility is probably going to take it to a certain point on the property and then say, dude, it's up to you from here on out. So then you're going to run it from pole to pole till it gets to your dwelling, and that's the electrician's going to do it. Those would be service conductors overhead. What we're talking about is the point where it makes the connection to the dwelling, okay? and it makes that connection, in this case, to the overhead service conductors or to the service drop if it's simply just a utility pole and the service drop comes down to the side of the house. That point where the connection is all the way down through the meter to the service equipment, that is going to be service entrance conductors. And that's what we're talking about. Okay? So just want to kind of put it into context of what we're talking about. Those are the service entrance conductors we're talking about. Okay, so with that said, we'll get back to part 4. Now, you have the general rule in 230.40, and this says, number of service entrance conductor sets. It says each service drop, set of overhead service conductors, set of underground service conductors, or service laterals shall supply only one set of service entrance conductors. So let's put this in a way that we can understand this and keep it simple. I have a dwelling unit on a property, and I have a pole that's mounted in the easement, the right of way for the utility. And there's the pole, and it has a transformer. It's coming from that transformer. It's a 12240 volt transformer. It's coming from that transformer down with a service drop to the side of the building, to the point of attachment, the line of demarcation. And as an electrician, I put a meter on the side of my house, and I let's just say I put an exterior NEMA 3R panel out there with a main disconnect. That was my service equipment. It's an exterior panel meeting the rules of 230.85 for the emergency disconnect, but it's a choice that I made, and now that's also my service disconnect, and I've labeled it accordingly. The connection from the point of attachment to the actual building, or the point where you're transitioning between the service drop and the conductors that me, as an electrician, ran up the side of the building to the weatherhead, that is my service conductors. That's my service entrance conductors. And of course, they are going to now transition down through the meter into my panel. Okay? So that is one set. And that's what this general rule is saying. I have one service drop, I have one service set, and it's going down. And that's it. Okay? That's basically what it's saying. But we have some exceptions to this rule that we want to follow. So we have to look at this different exceptions and how we do this. Okay? So we're going to look at each one of these and try to break it down as simple as possible. Hopefully you've got your code book, follow along. If you're driving in the car, don't have an Eric. Just kind of listen and pause it. And when you get at a stable location, crack that code book open, blow the dust off it, and let's try to look at what the code says. All right, so exception number 1. And again, the exceptions are here to have more than one set of service entrance conductors. Okay? And so again, I'll try to paint a picture. All right, number 1 exception, it says, a building with more than one occupancy shall be permitted to have one set of service entrance conductors for each service as permitted in 230.2. Run to each occupancy or group of occupancies. Okay, so let me give you one example here of how this might take place. So let's say that I have a building that it's a multi-occupancy building, and there's different occupancies in it. And these occupancies are separated in a sense that they have, they're separate occupancies within a building, and each one is permitted to have its own service. So under this, I take the one service to the building, and this would allow me to make a connection up at the point of attachment, and I could literally run my service entrance conductors around the buildings to the locations where it would go directly into the service equipment. Now, reality is you would run down and it would run through meters, which are not service equipment, by the way. They're just meters. And then they would stay out as long as they're on the exterior of the building. I would be able to then to continue to route those service entrance conductors to various locations and pop through or whatever and be able to actually hit those service equipment in each one of those separate occupancies. So that's just what this is allowing me to do. Now, this is outside of the building because to meet this, it still has to be service entrance conductors. And we don't want service entrance conductors to penetrate the building because then they're unprotected. So again, to kind of defeat this allowance. If you think about it, these are allowing service entrance conductors to encircle the building or go around to wherever it needs to go to outside of the building to get to the point where it's going to terminate into service equipment. Okay. So then it goes on to say, if the number of service disconnecting locations for any given classification of service does not exceed 6. So what this is saying is the general rule, 6 disconnect rule, is allowing us to be able to make a connection in, let's go to the 6 disconnects for any one service entrance conductor set. So if I were to go to, and of course we do know that in the 2020 code, we got rid of the 6 disconnect rule inside of a single cabinet. That's no longer allowed anymore. But I could take this application and run, and as long as I didn't exceed 6 disconnects, I could take that over to a certain location and then drop down, and then I could come into a trough, for example, and then I could come out and not exceed 6 disconnects for that set. Okay. So again, one way to also explain this would be, let's say I had a 12-unit apartment complex and I come down with one service drop. I would be able to make the connection at the service drop and then say split it off into 2 6 sets of meters with, let's say, individual 100 amp breakers associated with those meters or underneath them. I could come from that connection and I could take 2 different service entrance conductor sets, one down to the one with the 6 on one side and one down to the one with 6 on the other side, right next to it. And that would be okay. As long as I'm not exceeding 6, that is a classic example of where I can have more than one service entrance conductor set under this exception. You with me? All right. So theoretically, there's 12 there, but there's no more than 6 per service entrance conductor set. All right. Okay. So that covers that part of it. Now, of course, it talks about the labeling requirement in 230.2e that is applicable when it does not exceed 6. Now, and we're talking about service disconnect locations. So this could be quite a large building with many, many locations where we're going to have other service disconnecting locations. Okay, it's not just the 6 that might be one location, but this permits you to have them at other different occupancies. So when we have only 6, then we can get away with just following the rules of 230.2e, which is the labeling requirement. Now, if for any reason your number of service disconnect locations exceeds 6, and you might well do that in a large occupancy, okay, then what happens is once that takes place, now depending on the classification, all service disconnect locations for supply characteristics, together with any branch circuits or feeder supply sources, where applicable, of course, shall be clearly described using a graphic or text or both on one or more plaques located in an approved, again, AHJ, approved, readily accessible location on the building or structure served and as near as practical to the points of attachment or entries for each service drop or service lateral and for each set of overhead or underground service conductors. So we want to summarize this again. Is the great example that I gave is that exception number 1 is basically saying, look, I got one service drop comes to the building. Say it's a 12-unit complex, and I could branch off and have 2 sets of service entrance conductor sets running down, one to a 6-meter stack and then the other one running to another 6-meter stack, not exceeding 6 disconnects per each one of those sets. Typically the meter would be, and a 100 amp, let's say 100 amp disconnect would be into the meter assembly. It's made that way or below it, whatever. And then of course you got feeders that would lead from there going to the individual units. That's an example where you would use 230.40 exception number 1. So that's one example of that. Okay. All right. So let's look at exception number 2. And it kind of alluded to this in 230.2 when it made reference to exception number 2. But we're going to stick right here at 230.40 exception number 2. And I'm going to read it. It says, where 2 to 6 service disconnecting means in separate enclosures are grouped in one location. And for those that are asking a reference for that kind of thing, that's where you're going to look at 230.71b, which is the 2 to 6 disconnecting means rule. So anyway, back to where it was. It says where the 2 to 6 disconnected means in separate enclosures are grouped at one location and supply separate loads from one service drop, set of overhead service conductors, set of underground service conductors, or service lateral. One set of service entrance conductors shall be permitted to supply each or several such service equipment enclosures. To kind of give you an example of this is the easiest one I can give you. Let's say it's coming from a transformer and it's going underground and it's going to one building, and you're going to pop up and you're going to have 6 separate raceways that are going from the transformer, and it's going to 6 separate enclosures that are grouped in one location like this is referencing. And the major benefit here is sometimes you might have a multi-occupancy building. You might have a building that has a lot of loads, and this is typically, let's just say we had something where, and to show you how this can benefit you. Let's say we had a situation where we had a 2500 amp service and you had to do parallel sets of conductors, and it can become quite cumbersome to do that. Well, this rule would allow you, for example, to have maybe 6 400 amp sets to achieve the same load, but it would be in 6 different service disconnecting means. Okay, so it's basically subdividing the load amongst 6 different sets at each one of these. And of course, they got to be grouped, so they got to be at the same location to meet this allowance. But it becomes a really, from an engineering design perspective, it might have been more difficult to put a 2500 amp service in, where this rule example would allow me to have 6 400 amp sets of service interconductors to a single occupancy or a multi-occupancy building, instead of having a single main 250 amp service. Okay. Now, granted, you still have to meet your grouping, and those 6 have to be close, but that is what this is allowing you to do with this rule. So the real importance here is it eliminates that need for paralleling to get that large capacity by using this option. And so a lot of engineers will design it this way. And again, sometimes in order to get something that might be quite a few sets, well, this would allow you to break it down into 6 service disconnects and then subsequently handle the loads based on each one of those. Cumulatively, you're going to meet the load requirements that you need for the structure. So this is just a way to achieve this. And these would be service entrance conductors meeting this rule. Okay. All right. And of course, they'll be grouped together, so we don't have any problem with that. You can have up to 6 grouped at any one location, right? All right, so that covers kind of the exception number 2, kind of giving you that mental picture, and that's how some people would use it. That's how they would utilize it, okay? All right, the next one we're going to look at is exception number 3, and we'll look at that. So this one is real common when you have, and I'll go look at it both ways for you. So this is where you have a one-family dwelling. And so it says a one-family dwelling unit and its accessory structure. Let's say it's a detached garage, if you will. It says it shall be permitted to have one set of service entrance conductors run to each from a single service drop, set of overhead service conductors, set of underground service conductors, or a service lateral. So this is an example where you might have the meter that's installed on your dwelling, and you come up through the meter and you got obviously your service lateral, in this case, if it's underground, or your service drop is supplying the dwelling. But this would allow you to make a connection either in the meter or at the guest. You could make it at the weatherhead, depending on your sizing and all. This would allow you can have multiple risers there, but typically this is going to come out of the meter. It's a double lugged meter. It's going to come out of the meter. It's on the supply side. This would allow you to make that connection and continue those service entrance conductors down underground and over to that structure. And those would still be service entrance conductors. Of course, that is permissible here, and that's very common. Now, some people do it reversely. You'll see them do this to the detached structure and then pass simply straight through in the meter and continue it down as it goes over to the one family dwelling. Okay. So again, it's either or, but then the components is that it has to have a one family dwelling unit and any accessory building to that one family dwelling. So basically this is meaning that, again, if it's underground, you're coming up with the lateral into the meter, And then you could come out again, go underground, and go over and supply that accessory building all from that one service lateral. And if it was overhead, all from that one service drop. This is permitting you to do that, okay, in that application. Okay, the next one we'll look at is, let's see here, be number 4, exception number 4. Okay, so 2-family dwellings, multifamily dwellings, multiple occupancy buildings shall be permitted to have one set of service entrance conductors installed to supply the circuits covered in 210.25. So the easiest way to think about this, because of the nature of the buildings that we're talking about, 2-family, multifamily, multi-occupancy building, we're probably talking about things that are going to be dealing with common areas or common area loads that aren't going to be fed by an individual dwelling unit. So this would allow you to make a connection. Let's say if it was all overhead, you make a connection at the point of attachment, come off and hit a common house panel. And that's going to be an allowance for you to make that connection to suffice to supply power to those different branch circuits that are listed under 210.25. Now, if you go look at it, it says branch circuits in buildings with more than one occupancy. So that's why the reference was to a 2-family dwelling, multifamily dwelling, or multiple occupancy building. So typically, we're not going to fall under the A, which is dwelling unit branch circuits. Basically, that's telling you that your branch circuits, you can't use the wiring within your branch circuit to supply anything that's outside of that dwelling unit or that's not associated with that dwelling unit. But most certainly what we're going to do with this allowance is to hit an exterior panel that's going to meet the requirements of common areas. So you would look at 210.25B, probably where you'd focus the most. It says branch circuits installed for lighting, central alarm, signal, communications, and other purposes for public and common areas of 2-family dwellings, multifamily dwellings, and multi-occupancy buildings shall not be supplied from equipment that supplies an individual dwelling unit or tenant space. So this is allowing me to make that connection, run a separate set of service entrance conductors. Again, we're outside of the building, hit a panel, and that would be able to handle all of those common loads that we can't supply from an individual dwelling unit. Unless, of course, those loads are directly associated with the dwelling unit. So this is kind of like a house panel and all that exterior lighting and things like that. So this is allowing me to make a connection specifically for that. That's what that exception is all about, okay? And lastly, we're going to look at number 5 exception. Now, this one you probably will just be like, boom, it's in your head once I say it. But this is the allowance, again, for this to be able to make a connection to extend those service entrance conductors, to be able to supply different types of supply side connections, such as those that are covered in 230.82.5 or 230.82.6. Now remember, 230.82 is permitted connections on the supply side of your service disconnecting means. So when we look at 230.82.5, that one's talking about where you might have a connection to load management devices, fire pump connection equipment, fire and sprinkler alarms, and you meet the rules of 5, then a connection could be made to the supply side for this by the use of a separate set of service entrance conductor sets. So that could be doable. And then 6 talks about this, which is very common in what we do on the supply side, making a separate connection, let's say going from that drop, let's say it makes a connection up there at the point of attachment, and we have a separate set of service entrance conductors, if that's the choice of where you want to make this connection at. That could be run to, 6 is giving us options for photovoltaic systems, fuel cell systems, wind electric systems, energy storage systems, or interconnected electric power production sources, like a generator. They have conductors that can be connected on the supply side. And this is basically acknowledging that those conductors, you could make that connection, and those would be service entry conductor sets, and it's perfectly okay to have that take place on the supply side. Not a big deal. It permits me to make that kind of connection. And that's important because acknowledging that allows us to, again, like I did in a previous podcast, Let's Ask Paul, where I talked about all those connections on the supply side when it came to generators and dealing with 705 interconnected systems. Again, allowing you to make those connections. But here, it's just allowing a service entry conductor set, okay, to be connected on the supply side of the normal service disconnecting means. And it's permitted to supply each or several systems that are covered in 230.82.5 or 230.82.6 as we just explained. So that allows you to make that connection. So it's just telling you it's okay to make that connection for what you're doing. Okay. All right. That's pretty much the basic gist of 1 through 5. Again, I kept it at a very high level. If you have any additional questions on this, so you want me to dig deeper into something, talk about something in a little more detail other than where I covered it, please, by all means, go to paulabernathy.com and go on. And if you don't agree with any of this, I eagerly await your podcast or your video. Make sure you share that with me so I can go watch it and learn from you, the one of much wisdom. And I'm more than happy to let you know my thoughts of it. So if you want to send something in, go to paulabernathy.com and submit it on the portal. I look forward to seeing you in an upcoming episode and maybe answering your question live on a podcast. Until next time, folks, stay safe. God bless.